When your machine turns on, you're automatically set up for stitch 00, a plain stitch. You're automatically set up for stitch length of 2.5, which is the proper stitch length for a plain weave cotton. A heavier fabric would need a longer stitch length. You're automatically set up for a stitch width of 00. When you put your fabric in, make sure to set your pressure foot down gently. Stitching is different than sewing a seam. Seams and stitches are different. Stitches are used to sew seams. So first we're going to talk about stitching. I'm just going to run a basic stitch. I'm looking ahead of my needle, not right at it. If I want to turn a corner or go around a curve, I can gently guide it around. If I want to turn a sharper curve, I need to stop with my needle in the down position, sew a few stitches, tap my pressure foot to put my needle in the down position, tap my pressure foot, and make a tight little curve. If I want to turn a corner, I tap my pressure foot to put my needle in the down position. I lift my pressure foot lever, I rotate my fabric in my new direction, and then I start sewing again. At the beginning of or the end of a stitch, I might want to press my reverse button to lock my stitch in place. I pull it out gently a few inches, and I can cut it off on the thread cutter right there. Remember to pull gently. You can only pull your fabric out if your take-up lever is up, because that releases the tension dials. Sometimes, for instance, at the beginning or end of a seam, you might want to back up a little. This is your reverse button. Couple stitches back, locks your stitch. Sometimes you might want to sew further to the right or further to the left. So, if you have your stitch selector on a straight stitch, make sure your needle is up and your take-up lever is up. Then press your stitch width guide, and you will see the needle moving. In this case, to the left. If I want it to move to the right, I press this mirror, and then that moves it to the right. If that's too far to the right, I can back it up. And again, if I get to 0, I'm back in the middle. A zigzag stitch is another common stitch. A zigzag can be used for many different things, for instance, adding a bit of stretch to a knit fabric. So if we change this to 03, so I'm going to change my stitch selector to 03, and it's going to set me up at a basic zigzag medium stitch. So let's see what that looks like. Can do that. If I want my stitch length to be longer, I can do that. If I'm sewing a knit garment, I probably want a narrow stitch width And so here it's almost like a straight stitch. Just has a little bit of give to it when it's in a knit fabric. Here was my regular, wider and longer. So I'm going to sew a regular seam on a medium weight cotton woven. So I'm just going to go to my stitch length, my stitch selector of 0, 0, 0, 0, straight stitch. Normal stitch length, 2.5, no stitch width. There are two different seam widths that I usually work with. One is the 5/8 seam width that Commercial Patterns use, and one is a 1/2 inch stitch seam allowance, which is more commonly used in industry. It's important to know what your seam guide markings mean and measure them out so you know where you're supposed to be sewing for different seam allowances. I'm going to sew my 5/8 one first. I'm going to start out a couple stitches reverse, lock my seam, and I'm going to sew straight on down here. When I'm done, I can reverse, and that locks my stitch. Lift my presser foot. Don't show the back of that, because that's my, and there's my seam, sewing my two pieces together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I've sewed an even 5/8 inch seam so far, but now I call this texting and driving. Away I go, off across the center line. If you start to do this and your seam allowance isn't even, you cannot pick up your brush foot and move it back to the right place and keep sewing. If you do that, you will have a big jog here, and that's not good. If you were texting and driving, you need to seam rip back to where you were on track and start over again.